The world was already trembling beneath the weight of a war that stretched across continents. Yet another silence grew within the United States. It was not the silence of peace nor the calm after a storm. It was the silence of suspicion, the quiet unease of a community suddenly marked as the other. Japanese Americans, many of them born on American soil, raised in California valleys, Hawaiian plantations, or the crowded districts of Seattle and San Francisco, lived in fragile balance. Their parents carried the memories of another land, but their children pledged allegiance to this one. Still, every report from Tokyo, every headline about the rising empire, deepened the unease. Then came the day of December the 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not only a military assault, it was a fracture of trust. In a single morning, neighbors turned wary. Co-workers whispered. Friends looked away. Loyalty became a question, not a certainty. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the silence of families waiting for orders they could not control, of fathers uncertain whether their service would ever be accepted, of mothers watching their children marked by ancestry alone. This is the story of men who were asked to fight for a country that doubted them. Their battlefield would not be only the jungles or the islands. Their weapon would not be only the rifle. It would be language itself, the words of the enemy turned into a path toward survival. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not only a blow to American naval power. It struck at the heart of trust within the United States itself. In the days that followed, the fear of invasion and sabotage was sharpened by suspicion, and suspicion was directed at those who looked like the enemy. Japanese Americans, whether foreign-born or citizens by birth, suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Within weeks, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an order that would define their lives. Executive Order 9066. With the stroke of a pen, more than 100,000 men, women, and children were forced from their homes. They were ordered to leave the Pacific coast, abandoning farms, shops, and entire neighborhoods that had taken decades to build. Families were loaded onto buses and trains. Their destinations were not cities of promise, but dusty camps surrounded by barbed wire. The government called them relocation centers. Critics then and now called them concentration camps. Inside, families lived in makeshift barracks. Privacy was impossible. The air was filled with dust in summer and biting cold in winter. Loyalty to America was assumed suspect, and the burden of proof lay heavy on the confined. For many young Japanese Americans, the humiliation was doubled. They were citizens, educated in American schools, raised with American values, yet still treated as potential traitors. In the eyes of their neighbors, their ancestry outweighed their allegiance. And yet, amid this atmosphere of distrust, some chose to serve. Some saw military service as the only way to prove loyalty. Others hoped that wearing the uniform would open doors once closed by prejudice. The contradiction was brutal. While their parents remained behind barbed wire, the sons marched into training camps under the American flag, to fight for a country that doubts you, to wear its uniform while your family sleeps behind fences, to be loyal. Not because it is easy, but because it is the only way forward. This was the weight of distrust that these men carried into war. Long before the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, a handful of American officers understood that victory in the Pacific would not depend only on ships and guns. It would depend on words, on the ability to understand, intercept, and interpret the language of the enemy. Japanese was considered one of the most difficult tongues in the world to master. Few Americans could read it. Fewer still could speak it. But there was one community where this skill might be found, the sons and daughters of Japanese immigrants. In the autumn of 1941, the War Department quietly ordered language tests for nearly 4,000 soldiers of Japanese ancestry already serving in uniform. To their surprise, only a small fraction could read or write the language with fluency. Most had grown up in English-speaking homes, raised in what they called the American way of life. Still, from this fragile pool, a plan was born. On the first day of November 1941, the Military Intelligence Service Language School opened its doors at the Presidio of San Francisco. The inaugural class held 60 students, 58 of them Japanese Americans and 2 Caucasians. They trained under the guidance of Lieutenant Colonel John Weckerling and Captain Kai Rasmussen, officers determined to build a program from almost nothing. They were aided by civilian instructors like John Iso, a Harvard-educated lawyer who became the school's chief teacher, and others who scoured libraries for grammar books, dictionaries, and scraps of printed Japanese material. Only 5 weeks later, Pearl Harbor was attacked. The program teetered on the edge of collapse. Some officials demanded that the school be closed, fearing sabotage or divided loyalties. Yet a few visionaries insisted the training must continue. Rasmussen was recalled to his post, and with him came a new urgency. Soon the school was moved inland, far from the Pacific coast, now emptied of Japanese-American families. Camp Savage in Minnesota became its second home. There the students lived in cramped quarters, enduring long winters of snow and ice while studying day and night. The training was relentless. Translation of captured documents, radio intercepts, maps, military orders, and cryptography. Every word had to be precise. A mistranslated phrase could mean the difference between victory and disaster. By the autumn of 1944, more than 1,800 students had completed the courses. They were dispatched across the Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands in the north to General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, from Burma to the Philippines. Wherever they went, their task was the same: to unlock the thoughts of the enemy, to turn language into a weapon sharper than steel. They trained in silence, hidden from public knowledge. Their families were still behind fences, their loyalty questioned. Yet from this school of shadows would emerge a core of men whose words could shorten a war. War is often measured in artillery shells, in divisions, in bodies counted after the storm. Yet there was another battlefield, invisible but decisive, the battlefield of information. For the Nisei, the Japanese-American soldiers trained at the Military Intelligence Service language school, this became their domain. They carried no heavy artillery. They commanded no fleets. For instead, they carried notebooks, dictionaries, and voices trained to cut through the enemy's words. Their duty was to listen where others heard only noise, to read meaning from papers seized in the mud, to persuade prisoners to reveal what pride demanded they keep silent. From the frozen Aleutian Islands in the far north to the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the Nisei were scattered in small teams. They were present at Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, the Carolines, the Philippines. They marched behind Merrill's marauders through the hills of Burma and fought beside the British Chindits in the darkness of the jungle. They traveled with the Office of Strategic Services, slipping behind enemy lines to work with the Kachin tribes of northern Burma, men who guided Allied soldiers along hidden trails in the mountains. Everywhere the work was perilous. On the front line, their Japanese faces could be mistaken for those of the enemy. More than once, American soldiers raised rifles at them until guards shouted the truth. In the chaos of battle, the line between friend and foe blurred, and some Nisei were killed not by the enemy but by their own comrades. It was the cruelest irony, to risk death both from those they opposed and from those they served. When prisoners of war were captured, the Nisei stepped forward. At first, the Japanese refused to speak, for they had been trained to choose death over surrender. But the interpreters learned quickly. A cigarette, a sip of water, a small bandage placed on a wound could open a door no bullet ever could. Once a prisoner realized he would be treated as a human being, his silence cracked. Maps were drawn, unit strengths described, plans whispered in low voices. Each word was a weapon, and the Nisei made those words count. They became known as cave flushers, moving into tunnels where Japanese soldiers and terrified civilians hid. Sometimes they entered alone, speaking softly into the darkness, urging surrender over suicide. At times, dozens of men emerged from the shadows with their hands raised. At other times, the answer was the blast of a grenade and silence once more. Victory was measured not only in ground taken, but in knowledge seized. A captured diary, a translated order, a single confession could save entire battalions. These men fought not with rifles, but with language. And yet, each word they spoke carried the weight of suspicion. Suspicion from the enemy and suspicion still from the country they served. Okinawa, a single island, yet the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. To the Japanese Empire, it was the shield before the homeland. To the Allies, it was the final stepping stone toward invasion. The clash would become a storm of unimaginable scale. The defenders numbered more than 75,000 Japanese soldiers, reinforced by nearly 25,000 Okinawan conscripts, organized into a home guard. They carved into the limestone, building tunnels, bunkers, and hidden firing positions. They swore to fight until death, and death was the promise they intended to keep. Against them, the American 10th Army assembled more than 500,000 men. 5 Army divisions and 3 Marine divisions landed on the beaches, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. It was the might of an empire against the desperation of another. Amid this vast machinery of war stood the Nisei linguists. They carried no heavy rifles, yet their role was decisive. From the very first days of the battle, they captured and translated vital documents, operational maps, coded orders, and diaries stained with mud and blood. One such discovery revealed the final Japanese defense plan. Another, a contour map of the island found on the body of an enemy officer. These translations shaped the strategy of the American advance, but Okinawa demanded more than documents. It demanded voices. The island's civilians, more than 400,000 souls, had been told by the Japanese army that Americans would torture, rape, and kill without mercy. Mothers clutched children in caves, fathers carried grenades for suicide. Entire families prepared to leap from cliffs rather than face capture. The Nisei entered the caves. They spoke in the dialect of the island, a dialect that only a handful understood. They promised life, where the Japanese commanders demanded death. Sometimes 300 soldiers laid down their arms because a single Nisei spoke with calm authority. Sometimes entire villages emerged from darkness, guided not by bullets but by words, and yet not all could be saved. Many soldiers chose self-destruction. On Saipan months earlier, civilians had hurled themselves from cliffs in waves of mass suicide. Now in Okinawa the pattern returned. Thousands died by grenade, by fire, by their own hands. Still, the Nisei fought for every life they could turn from that fate. By the battle's end, more than 50,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians lay dead. Yet more than 10,000 surrendered, the largest mass capitulation in the history of the Imperial Army. Nearly 300,000 civilians survived, 2/3 of the island's people. Historians agree that without the work of the Nisei, the toll would have been far higher. In Okinawa, language became stronger than steel. Each word translated, each plea spoken into the darkness, was an act of resistance against death itself. The Nisei could not end the slaughter, but they could save thousands from silence. In the island of sacrifice, their voices carried the weight of life. When the guns finally fell silent, the work of the Nisei did not end. Across the shattered islands of the Pacific, Japanese garrisons surrendered, often reluctantly, sometimes in disbelief. The interpreters were there to receive them, to explain terms, to ensure that lives were not lost in the confusion of final moments. They moved quickly into prisoner-of-war camps. Japanese soldiers, conditioned for death, now faced captivity. The Nisei stood between them and their captors, translating pleas, easing suspicion, preventing violence. At war crimes trials in Manila, in Tokyo, in smaller courtrooms scattered across Asia, they became the bridge that carried the words of the accused to the ears of the judges. Every testimony, every confession, every defense passed through the minds and mouths of men whose loyalty had once been questioned. The United States Army knew their value. Many were asked to remain in uniform as occupation forces spread through Japan. Some accepted, building careers that stretched for decades, climbing into the officer corps. Others returned home, leaving the military but carrying memories that rarely reached their families. They had lived between worlds, American soldiers who carried the tongue of the enemy, patriots who had proven loyalty while their parents and siblings had spent the war behind barbed wire. Recognition was slow. During the war, their very existence was kept hidden. Commanders feared that Japanese relatives still living under the empire might face reprisals if their sons' service became known. After the war, secrecy lingered, and modesty kept many silent. For years, the nation knew little of what had been done in its name by men it had once doubted. Only in the early 1970s, nearly 3 decades after the fighting had ended, did documents begin to surface. The Freedom of Information Act revealed fragments of the truth. At last, the record could be read. The translations that had shaped campaigns, the interrogations that had saved lives, the voices that had shortened the war. General George Willoughby, intelligence chief to General Douglas MacArthur, declared that their efforts had cut 2 full years from the Pacific conflict. Their legacy endures quietly. Medals were awarded, citations presented, honors bestowed, but often long after the men had faded from memory. The Military Intelligence Service Language School itself moved to Monterey, California, and grew into a vast institution, teaching dozens of tongues to tens of thousands of students. Its foundation, however, remained those first fragile classes of Nisei in 1941, men who studied under suspicion, yet gave their country the one gift it most needed: understanding. History often remembers divisions, fleets, and weapons. Yet wars are also turned by words, by voices, by the fragile thread of meaning between enemies. The Nisei linguists carried that thread through some of the darkest years of the 20th century. Their story is not one of spectacle, but of silence. A silence finally broken by the knowledge that without them, the war would have been far longer and far more cruel. The war had ended, but the silence endured. For many Nisei veterans, the return home was not a parade nor a public celebration. They stepped off trains and buses into towns that barely knew what they had done. Some were met with gratitude, others with indifference, and too many still with suspicion. They had fought for freedom abroad, while their families had lived behind barbed wire at home. This contradiction could never be erased. In the decades that followed, their story remained hidden. Some chose never to speak of it. Others found that when they tried, no one seemed willing to listen. The memory of concentration camps on American soil was uncomfortable. The notion that loyalty had been proven in blood, while citizenship had been denied, too painful to confront. And so silence wrapped itself around the veterans, as thick as the jungle mists where they had once served. Yet memory has a way of resurfacing. In the early 1970s, nearly 30 years after the last shot was fired, documents once locked in classified files were opened. The public began to learn that the translations, the interrogations, the whispered negotiations in dark caves had not been minor episodes, but crucial to victory. Scholars pieced together the fragments. Veterans groups began to tell their stories aloud. Slowly, the nation recognized what it had owed for so long. In time, honors arrived. Presidential citations were bestowed. Memorials were raised in Hawaii, in California, in Washington, D.C. Bronze plaques and stone walls carried names that had once been hidden. But for many veterans, the recognition came too late. Their youth had been given in silence, their middle years passed in quiet labor, and only in old age did their voices receive an audience. Their legacy extends beyond the medals. It lies in the classrooms of Monterey, where the language school they built in secret grew into one of the greatest institutions of military linguistics in the world. It lies in the archives, where translations of enemy plans still testify to their precision. It lies in the families who remember fathers and grandfathers who carried both suspicion and duty, and chose to serve nonetheless. History tends to speak loudly of victories won by divisions and fleets, by generals and presidents. But the story of the Nisei is a quieter one. It is the story of how words, patiently studied and carefully spoken, became weapons more enduring than bullets. It is the story of men who carried the enemy's language and turned it into a tool of survival for their comrades. Their silence was long, but it was not empty. It was filled with courage unacknowledged, with loyalty tested, with sacrifice given without promise of reward. And when at last that silence broke, it revealed not just a chapter of war, but a lesson for generations, that freedom can be defended not only with arms, but also with understanding.